Welcome to the Writers League of Texas podcast, conversations and presentations featuring writers and industry professionals talking about the craft and business of writing. More information about this discussion, including details on our panelists and presenters, can be found at writersleague.org. We hope you enjoy the discussion.
Thank you so much. Our topic tonight is the craft and business of short stories. Let's get to it. Start with some brief bios of our panelists. To my left is David Afsharirad. He's the editor of the year's best military and adventure science fiction series from Baen Books. His stories and nonfiction have appeared in various magazines and anthologies. Please welcome David. Oscar Casares is the author of the story collection Brownsville and the novel Amigoland, which have earned him fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Copernicus Society of America, and the Texas Institute of Letters. His first book, Brownsville, was selected by American Library Association as a notable book of 2004. Amigoland, a novel also set in Brownsville, was the 2009 selection for the Mayor's Book Club, so you may have read it then, a citywide reading campaign supported by the Austin Public Library. His essays have appeared in Texas Monthly, the New York Times, the Washington Post, on National Public Radio, and his new novel, Where We Come From, is due out May 2019. Since 2004, he has taught creative writing at the University of Texas at Austin. Please welcome Oscar. Jack Kaulfus is the author of the short story collection Tomorrow or Forever. Their work has been published in Acapella Zoo, Heavy Feather Review, and Off the Rocks, among other journals. Jack teaches high school English, holds an MFA in creative writing from Texas State University, and when all the grading is finished, Jack plays in the queer Americana band Brand New Key. Please welcome Jack. And Rebecca Markovits has been the co-editor of the literary magazine American Short Fiction since 2012. Before joining ASF, Markovits was the executive editor and co-author of The Fearless Critic, a guide to Austin's restaurants. She has been a regular book reviewer for the Austin American Statesman, and her essays and reviews have appeared, among other places, in the Texas Observer and in Texas Monthly. Please welcome Rebecca. So we have a range of short story professionals with us tonight. We've got writers and editors and anthology editors, and so we're going to kind of cover the gamut. I thought we would start, I guess it's where they all start, with the writing part. And Oscar, I don't know, maybe you can start us off. Because you've written a story collection and you also teach, this craft to students. When you or when your students are just sitting down and you've got a thing that you're excited by, whether it's a voice or a plot or a situation or whatever, it's not immediately clear to everyone when they begin what they've got. If it's a novel, if it's a novella, if it's a very long story, if it's a very short story, like sort of what the frame is going to be. And in those early stages, how do you advise students to figure that out? Like how long and how big and deep this thing is going to be?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Yeah, that's a tough one because
we start hard.
Yeah, well, you're in a very, very dark hole, and it's a very dark night, and it's not even a well that you're in. I mean, it's just there's air, but barely, and some way you have to find your way out of that. And for me, and I guess I suggest this to students, but I mean everyone works differently. But I'm waiting to hear a voice. And that I only get to that by writing a lot and sort of trying to figure out, get tuned to the frequency that I need to hear the voice that's going to carry this story. And with the first novel, I remember writing upwards of about 300 pages and walking in for dinner and telling my wife I had just written the first page. And she said, what have you been doing for the last 2.5 years? I was taxiing to, but it takes, you've got to be patient, and you've got to, when you click onto it, when you're sort of on that path. And for me, once I sort of sense that I've touched something that, and it I could show that line, that phrase, that paragraph, whatever it may be, to 1,000 people, and it would make absolutely no sense. They wouldn't do anything with it because it just wouldn't resonate with the way it's touched me in my own experience. And I sort of know where it's going at that point. I sort of know how it's going to unfold, and I've got sort of a way out of that hole, or so I think.
Jack, how about you? You've published a story collection. Several of the stories have been published in various places, but I know that you're working on a novel as well. I mean, when you sat down, did you think, okay, I am writing a story now, I will do that? Or was it a bit like Oscar was talking about, where you're just writing pages and pages and pages, and then something clicks, and you know what you're off and doing?
I rarely know what I'm doing with the story until it kind of takes shape. But I generally will start with a scene or with I guess a character situation that really speaks to me and allows me to feel excited and like this is worth writing down. And sometimes it goes nowhere. And sometimes I just have a bunch of scenes on a bunch of pieces of paper. And sometimes if I follow that scene, then it'll take me where I'm supposed to go. And when I do that, then I allow a little bit of air so that I can be surprised by something that I didn't think I wanted to write or didn't know that I was going to write. And that can be really fun. But as far as stories go, there's a lot of stopping and starting for me, and it takes generally a good 3 or 4 months. I'm not super prolific, so it takes a good 3 or 4 months for me to find the shape of a story, and I might have a lot of false starts. But if I keep following, or if I keep trying to find those scenes that make me feel excited, then I know now that I can trust that they will eventually find their way together, as long as I feel like they're in the same story.
So you mentioned that you're not prolific, that a story will take you a while. And on our Facebook event page, we had a quote from Ray Bradbury that said, you write, I don't know, something like 52 short stories, and they're all terrible, and the 53rd one will be better. And we had an event in East Texas a while back, and I was talking with Joe Lansdale, the story writer out in East Texas, and he said that when he was learning to write, he had taken a break off work, and he wrote 90 stories, one a day for 90 days, and they were all crap and all terrible. But then on the 91st day, he figured something out. And is that just because Lansdale and Bradbury are crazy that they would write that way, like a story a day? What is your all's process in terms of how long does it take months to create a short story as it does for Jack? Does it take only a few days? What's your process, David?
So I feel like the longer something sits, it loses momentum for me. Now it can be that it takes a long time and I'm working on it for a long time, but I will either abandon things and then sometimes come back to them. But to me, that's a little different than kind of slowly accumulating over the course of 3 months. It might, I've started things and then 2 years later, what was that? And then you reread it and something sparks and then you have the ending to it. But I tend to work a little faster and kind of because I'm too much of a shiny objects kind of, and so I'm working on a novel now, and it's been tough for me to just keep your nose down, keep your nose to the grindstone, and crank out, keep working on it, because I keep being like, what about this idea over here? Because I'm excited about it, and so for me, keeping that excitement up and doing something, it doesn't necessarily have to be quickly. It doesn't have to be a story a week or a story. God, I don't know how you could do a story a day, although you meet Joe Lansdale and you see his energy level and you understand how he could do it. But I guess hopefully that answers.
Sure, yeah. What about, so at a certain point you're gonna click, as Oscar said, and the story's gonna begin to take shape, and you're gonna hopefully come up with a pretty solid beginning. But I want to turn it over to our journal editor for a moment, because story beginnings are kind of where you start with a piece. And when you're going through a slush pile, which is considerable, and you're doing this sometimes when you're super tired and you got other things to do, and you've read a lot of pieces. What is it about a story beginning that catches you? Is there kind of general thing, or is there a kind of general thing that turns you off?
Well, I'm going to start out by saying something sort of awful and prosaic and obnoxious, but Honestly, the very first thing when you're reading story after story after story that you see is the font and the layout. And it sounds like an obnoxious thing to say. It shouldn't make a difference. I try not to have it make a difference, but if things are in a weird font, if things are, generally we receive things double-spaced, if things are single-spaced, you immediately start that story reading it with an unconscious maybe bias against
So Comic
it.
Sans is what you suggest,
I recommend
right?
Comic Sans.
Yeah.
Noteworthy.
Clip art, like clip art and
so
purple.
keep it as-
Single
as-
space is manifesto territory.
Yeah, right, exactly. Don't undervalue the importance of having something just look presentable. But I really don't think that should be that important as it is. And also, I'm not somebody who, if there's a typo in the first sentence, immediately dismisses it. I don't feel like that should be that important. But what does really matter, obviously, is that the first paragraph is well written. And it doesn't even matter what the plot is, if it seems like a bright idea. If the writing has a cliche in it, you're going to dismiss it very quickly. So make sure that the first page, that the writing is spot on, honed, rewritten until it's really sharp. I don't love a gimmick beginning. At least it has to be a really good gimmick and followed through the whole way.
Explain what you mean by that, by a gimmick beginning.
I wish I could think of an example right now, which I can't, but you could imagine, I don't know, something that starts, he woke up dead, or something like that. Something that you're like, oh, what's that? I don't have that reaction. I think, ease me into a story in a way that makes earns that respect for me to then go with you when you do something kooky. But that, I hesitate to answer these things because editors' tastes are different. I probably am a little bit more traditional in my taste than my co-editors, which is why it's great. There are two of us editing the journal, and we joke that I like the boring stories and she likes the sad stories, and we come together on the boring, sad stories. But honestly, beginnings are great. Beginnings are full of possibility. Endings is usually where the stories all fall off and go haywire. Endings are harder, I think.
Right. How many stories have you read where you are just in love with it, and you get to halfway and you're like, uh-oh, this is still good, and then you get to the end and you're like,
why?
And you're like, why did I just
Why
read
did they do that? Yeah.
I every January or so, mid to late January, I'm on the admissions committee for one of the MFA programs at UT, which means for the last 14 or so years, in that month, I've read a lot. And I'm always worried that, after I've read, I don't know, 24 stories or whatever, and it's getting late, and I'm like, oh God, I'm going to do a disservice to the next one I read, and I feel like, well, maybe I should just put it away, but there's the damn pile. I got 2 more to read tonight, or I'm going to fall behind. But this hesitation that I'm going to be so weary and just fatigued, and then I read it, and it's like, this is like going to like you're going used clothes shopping, and you're just going through a bin, and you're just sort of like, and then suddenly it's like, Versace, I've got right here, and you're like, you can be completely like drunk. Not that I was ever drunk when I was doing this, but it pierces through. Doesn't matter how tired you are, how jet lagged, whatever. When that voice comes off the page, you know it, and there's someone speaking to me, and and I won't say 9 times out of 10, but most of the time, there's some agreement that there's something there. It doesn't automatically mean that they get in, but it's set apart from the rest.
I remember reading one of the Best Americans a few years ago, and that whoever edited it had said that she sat on a plane and read the stories, and if the story could pierce through the chaos of a plane, then it had a good chance of making it in.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, going off something you said, Rebecca, and this is like there's several of my students in the class or in the room right now, and one of the first things I say, and really they can sort of walk out after I say this, and some do. The big lesson, the big revelation is that you've signed up for this class. Someone has encouraged you that you have some talent, and you You may have some talent. But what you have to understand is nobody wants to read what you've written. No one. Just accept that. Your mother, your grandmother, your boyfriend, no one. I mean, they're curious. They want to know what you're doing in that room for so long, and they want to justify, like, what the hell were you in there all afternoon doing, or till 3 a.m. They don't really want to read it. They don't really want to read it. So you have to make them want to read it. You have to coax them in. You have to give them a read. You want them to lean into the story, that there's something that's worth their time in those first few pages. And those first few pages sort of can make or break the story. There's some slow starts. Obviously, there's some stories that you don't see at the very beginning, but they start building.
Jack, what a problem that story writers and probably all writers have is you have a strong beginning, but then at a certain point you have to sort of like work in some backstory, some context, some like here's the stuff that's going on around that really good beginning. Do you have any strategies for how you do that or ways that you approach that? And I feel like in the New Yorker, every essay is like narrative beginning, space break, and then they were born in Maryland, and you see short stories that do something kind of like that as well. What's your approach?
Well, the first thing that I really try to figure out is where's the emotional core of my story, and how do I want my reader to feel? And I'm not really thinking about an ideal reader when I'm writing, except for maybe, I don't know, some poor queer person who's never read anything queer before, which, was me until I was in my 20s. But what I'm thinking about is what's the emotional core that every time I return to the story, what am I going to remember? And I know now that if it speaks to me, then it's going to speak to somebody else too, possibly. So what I try to do is I try to figure out that distance first. So if I want to create some distance and I want it to have I write a lot of speculative fiction. So if I want there to be more mystery involved, or if I want something to feel more sort of otherworldly, then I might create distance. And I might do that through point of view, or picking out a setting that maybe doesn't feel too familiar to me, so that I'm writing in a mysterious place too. Or if I want the distance to not be if I feel like it's a more emotional story and a more intimate story, then I might pick a different point of view. I might pick a first person point of view, and I might repeat scenes, start to repeat scenes in a way that is that gets at that emotional place that I'm trying to get to. And so as long as I follow that, then the structure will follow too. And I'm not afraid, I know this is super unpopular, but I'm not afraid of a flashback. And I've been told so many times to just avoid all flashbacks altogether. But I think that they can be done well, and I think that there's room for them, especially if they're not too long and they add something to the present as well. So I love a flashback that's kind of starts that is only part of a sentence. So we learn a little bit about a character, and then we learn something about their present as well in the same sentence. I love those little treasures, and a lot of times that finding out how I want to use the backstory will also help to structure the scenes. And in the last few years, I've given myself permission to not follow rules, which has been really nice. Now that I know what the rules are, I teach high school students, so I make sure that I teach them all the rules. And then once they get to college, then I kind of set them free and say, now you should go break the rules. Sorry, any professors here? Now you should go break the rules, once you know how to write. So I've given myself permission to kind of break rules when it comes to structure, things like no flashbacks, and the ending has to be inevitable and surprising, things that sort of get taught. And I have to say that one of the first things that Tom Grimes told me at my MFA program was that nobody wanted to read my work. And I have carried that with me all my since, because because there are no guarantees, and you can't do it because you think someone wants to read your work. You have to do it because you want people to read your work.
Right at the very beginning, I was dying to have someone read my work, because I kind of took this leap of faith. I had actually been working right across the street. I worked for several years at GSD&M, and in whatever it was, 96 or something, I started writing that summer, and 5 months later walked in and I quit my job, not having published anything, or just thought I'd take a year off and see where it went. And I could only do that because I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I just didn't know. If I knew now, I wouldn't do it. It was just completely insane. But I was dying to have someone validate what I was writing. They weren't the pieces weren't even ready to be sort of submitted anywhere. They were just really kind of shorts, maybe 3 or 4 pages or something like this. And I remember showing it to a writer, and he said that to me, and I thought, you are just pissy and tired, and you shouldn't write anymore. That's the wrong thing to say to somebody just starting out. Of course, now I say it every semester, and it's I think at times I have fallen into that trap of, when you're getting that response, to try to elicit it to what sort of a reader might react to, and it's taken me a while to sort of come back around to writing mainly for myself. Now, obviously, I'd like the work to be read and published, but at this point, really, trying to make myself happy, and hopefully, somebody else gets it too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Somebody mentioned endings earlier. That's a place where you can sort of like make readers happy or not. David, I wonder, both in your own writing and reading stories for the anthology, do you have a sense for what makes an ending work? Is it like that sort of like that cliche that Jack mentioned, which is like inevitable but surprising, which is like, that's all I have to do, All right. But like, just do that, But like, what brings a story to a satisfying close, and like, how do you get there as a writer?
It's hard to say, and as I'm thinking over these questions you're asking, it's just, to me, so much of this, I feel like I have the same kind of answer, which is that it's just so much of a feel to me, and it's hard to articulate. What makes it satisfying is it feels satisfying to me. And what's interesting is, of course, what I find satisfying and what whoever you out there might find satisfying aren't necessarily the same thing, I've got a friend, and if it's not a happy ending, he gets mad, I don't read things and watch movies to see life's terrible enough as it is, that's his attitude, and I'm like, but it was so depressing, the sad and boring stories, But I think, there are certain sort of promises that are set up by the beginning or the middle of a story, and that doesn't necessarily mean you have to fulfill them, but you have to not fulfill them in a way that felt purposeful. So, if the protagonist doesn't get, to be very cliche, the girl, right? It's set up like they're going to get married at the end, and they don't. It has to not just feel like, well, why didn't you have them get together at the end? That there's a satisfying thing that they didn't get together. If that makes sense. I know that's a very cliche. Don't write that boring story, but something maybe we've all seen though.
There is money in that story.
There is money in that story. There's gold in our hills. But yeah, I guess if that makes sense. So there is sort of like an expectation that's set up that the story is going to resolve. Maybe not, you don't know the exact way, but there's promises made. And it doesn't have to mean that, again, just to reiterate, the exact same thing I just said, that you give it to the reader in the way they want. But it has to feel like you did something purposeful and that you knew you were setting these things up. I guess that is my answer.
Rebecca, when you're reading a story, is that like the idea that David's talking about, that a story promises certain things and then knocks those pins down? Like, if you feel that a story is like you're liking a story, but it's starting to like come apart as you read it, is it because they've lost they've lost track of the promises they made, or when a story really works, do you have that sense of what brings a story to a close in a satisfying way for you?
It is nice as a reader or an editor to feel like you're in the hands of somebody who, even more than poetry or voice, has competence. This feeling that they are in control of what they're doing is a really nice thing for a reader. That's partly, you were joking about the sort of the marriage plot, but that's really an appeal of the marriage plot and of a lot of 19th century novels or something, is that you know where it's going and where it's going to end, and it frees up all sorts of enjoyment as you're going along the way. But I find more often, certainly maybe not in the average story, including all the stories that are just not even close, but certainly in the stories that are close to being ready, the problem isn't that they lose control, is that they overplay their hand, and that the author, often, the Coco Chanel line about how do you know when you're ready to go out, you put everything on, you take one thing off, and often I found that one thing you take off is literally the last sentence of a story. Often shouldn't be there, I've found as an editor. Just writers, I feel like, are anxious that their idea hasn't come through and that their reader is not with them, and so it's obvious to them, but is it obvious to the reader, because they have all this additional narrative going on in their heads, and so they want to hit the point home one more time and take that last hit out, and suddenly all this possibility opens up to the story, and that sounds like a cheap trick, and it is a cheap trick, but it can be quite a powerful trick often, I find.
I know exactly what you're talking about, an ending that sort of begins to explain or hits a note too hard. When an ending is satisfying, so obviously there's this sort of the bringing the mechanics to a close of the marriage plot or whatever. Right. What about in terms of is there, for a while, epiphany endings were the thing, and you saw them over and over and over, and then they kind of went away, and then sometimes you see them, sometimes you don't. But do you have a sense for the emotional impact of an ending? Do you want it to be so you're getting a hit? Is it and then you sort of ease into the rest of the life outside of the story?
It feels like a question of taste. I don't want to get hit at the end of a story. I have a natural suspicious reaction to it, which is almost certainly unfair. I know that Adina, my co-editor, wants to feel that a lot more strongly than I do, and I think it's just a question of taste partly. And that's obviously a question of how well done it is.
All right, so we've started at the beginning, we got through the middle, down to the end, and then before we send that story out, we're going to do the thing that writers loathe, which is we're going to title the story. Anybody want to jump in? How do you figure out a title? Oscar, for your story collection, it's Brownsville. It's the name of the place where the stories are set. Yeah. The first story in that collection is Mr. Z. It's the name of the biggest jerk in the story, although not the main character. Yeah. What was your approach to finding those titles in that collection?
Well, let me step back and just to touch on something that occurred to me with the endings. I know in teaching, a good part of the time the ending can be a train wreck. It can just be a complete disaster. But I don't necessarily suggest that the writer go back and work on the ending, because usually the ending isn't. In some cases, pull back a little bit and suddenly it does work. But in a lot of the cases, at least with students early in the process, it's the middle that isn't doing enough. It isn't giving them enough opportunity to and avenues to take the story at the end. So they don't. The story's so focused on, for instance, plot or developing one character in this one exclusive vein of their life, and they get to the end and the options are very limited, other than something completely unexpected, which feels false. So the idea of really getting in there and giving life and some vitality to the character midway, early enough that when you get to the end, you have some options to go. With the collection, I'll tell you, somebody suggested early on you should call it Brownsville, and I thought that was the stupidest thing I'd ever heard. And mainly because it already had occurred to me. And I thought it was stupid because I just thought, like, okay, somebody out there, and when I'm writing these stories, and when I'm away at graduate school, people are asking me, is this a real place? Is this a real place? Are you ready? They thought it was some Garcia Marquez sort of, region that I'd made up where all these people, and I, they're thinking that, and then I'm thinking, well, what if people are, see the title, they see Brownsville, and they see all these Mexicans, and they think, oh, I get it. It's all these brown people living in Brownsville. And I thought, oh no. I mean, anyway, I couldn't even consider the idea for a year or two. It'd be interesting to go back and look at the stories in their original form, because I think a lot of them didn't have the titles that they ended up with. I know that when I was piecing it together, when I had submitted to my agent, and I didn't know what the hell I was doing, and I just sort of sent them the whole thing as I had written or published them. And he said, you need to find a way of packaging this, because I don't know that your first story is necessarily your strongest story, and that there needs to be some cohesion here. And so I remember going through the stories sort of line by line and out of order, and looking for lines that I felt like were maybe a little bit more provocative and maybe spoke to what was happening in the story. And a lot of those lines became the section breaks, right? Don't believe anything he tells you, that came out of one of the stories. And then I remember, this idea of packaging. I was like, what do you mean? Just here. Why am I having to do this? And I remember laying the stories out on the floor with a title pretty big, some note card on top of them, and then standing on a chair and looking down and trying to figure out how the pieces fit together. The sort of the conflicts that the characters were dealing with, even the sort of terrain that they were in. So the title is the last thing. It's the absolute last thing. I mean, on occasion I'll have it early, and then it's even, forget it when you're doing essays and you're sending it off somewhere, because there's always some editor who wants to title it. So yeah, I don't really think too much about the title until everything else is done, and then and it was easy with the collection. But I think if you start off sort of putting that pressure on yourself, this is the title and this is what I'm writing toward, it can kind of hem you in. It does me anyway.
Jack, I saw you nodding when Oscar was talking about like looking down and trying to piece the stories together. And so you've got a collection. How did you go about piecing the stories together?
So I was nodding because I was thinking about my experience with the collection, and I was thinking about the editors sitting here. So I thought my titles were just brilliant. I thought they were perfect in every way. And then I sent it off, and the editors were like, "These are terrible. You've got to change every single title." They liked the title of the collection, which my friend Renee actually gave me, kind of. Yes, and so the title of the collection was good, but then the rest of the stories, for whatever reason, the titles of the stories themselves weren't working. And I got actually a lot of feedback from both my editors about ways to structure the order. And I had such a difficult time figuring out the order of the stories that eventually I just kind of let my second editor do it, because at some point I was so married to the way that I saw the collection that it wasn't making, some of the choices that I had made weren't making sense to him, and he didn't think that they would make sense to a reader. Because there were some recurring characters, and I wanted them like right next to each other so people would notice. And I think it's kind of a little bit what you were talking about with, you take one thing off. And he said we want that to echo at both ends of the book. We don't want that to be two stories right in a row where we're sort of where you're sort of feeding them. We want to let them discover that, or not, and then come back to it. So I'm actually interested in y'all's experiences with titles. Is that something that, like, I don't know, what's the magic there?
Editors, what's the magic?
I feel like such a jerk because honestly, as you asked the question, I thought, oh, titles are the most easily changed part of the story. Isn't very nice. Although I don't think we have changed that many titles in the time I've been at the magazine. It's much easier for a title to be horrible than it is for a title to be great. And so playing it safe with a title is always a perfectly fine thing to do. You know,
So don't suck.
Name it after the main character, name it after the city, name it, something totally straightforward. You're not going to go far wrong with that. There are some great titles, but there are many bad titles, and they're easily changed, so it's not a big deal.
Nobody taught, I read a great title the other day.
Right.
I mean, they use the titles as sort of the handle to sort of talk about it, but it's, don't mess it up, but.
You don't want to irritate your reader with the title, right? I mean, that's not. Nobody wins there.
Yeah, I had never thought of it that way, but I think you're right. Like, don't suck, and you'll be okay. Like, you could shoot for the moon, and But then I often wonder too. I mean, there are some titles just on their own that are wonderful, but is the things you think of as being a great title great because it's very good, not great, but it fits the story so well, right? And so it's like, how much of that is just the title is great, and how much are you taking into account the movie or the book that you loved that had that title, right?
Everybody should just be pleased they're not writing nonfiction if you aren't writing nonfiction, because it seems to me in nonfiction, every editor demands a colon with something long after it that automatically makes it worse. So at least you're free of the dreaded colon.
The more that a title looks like the title to like an academic panel, the better, right? All right, so we're moving into the academia. We're moving into the business side now. We're talking about titles. We're talking about selling things. Rebecca, with ASF, what is there a percentage of how many submissions do you get in a given time period? How many do you take that come in, on the slush pile? How many do you take that you've solicited? Generally, how does that work?
I hate answering this question because it's so discouraging, and I recognize it's discouraging. We get maybe around 400 stories a month, and we publish 3 times a year, so it's 1,200 per issue, is that right? From Slush, and then, I don't know, it varies a lot how many we publish that are from Slush and how many are solicited, but let's say it's 50-50. But then we also have contests. We run 2 contests a year, which get about 1,000 stories. So it's to publish in the end, each issue has 5 to 7 stories in it. That's a very low ratio of publication to stories received. I know that's horribly discouraging, and that's just the way the math works out. We are the one tip I would give people, and I don't know if this is true for all magazines. It happens to be true for ours, and I wish it weren't as true. We're much further behind on Slush than we would like to be. Contests, we have to read by a certain time because we've got the next contest coming. We've got a judge judging our contests. So if you want a quicker response, contests are quicker than Slush in terms of getting an answer. They're more expensive, so I feel like it's a greedy thing for me to say, but they are a quicker response, and the publication rate is not significantly different.
How do you get through all of those submissions? That's a lot.
It's a lot, yeah.
How many readers do you have, and how many hands will a story go through?
The better a story is, or the more liked a story is, the more hands it goes through. We have a varying, somewhere sort of 10 to 15 readers. It depends on who's with us at the time. It's volunteer readers. They're angels. The people who read for us. It's highly appreciated. If they reject most of them, and then the ones they like go for a second read. If they like it, but they don't love it, but they think somebody else might like it, it also goes for a second read. So generally, the longer you haven't heard back, the better a sign it is. And then we, my co-editor and I and our managing editor then churn through those second and third reads. The other thing is that there's specific slots. So we, for example, publish on our website every month a story that's 2,000 words or shorter. So we do separate reading for that, and that is another way. I would recommend you pay very close attention to what exactly a journal publishes or a website publishes and what length it is, and you can tailor and really improve your odds by finding the right story for the right slot. So there's that as well. I sort of feel like I've lost track of the question.
No, it was a good answer to the question that you hate answering. But David, and so then you edit an anthology, and so like,
Yeah.
these are stories that have already been published in various
Sure.
journals, and then like it's sort of like a best of. How does that work?
I just read a crap ton of science fiction.
How did they come to you in the first place?
I have in the past asked, so that it all has to be published within the calendar year. Okay, so like I'm reading for the 5th volume. This is Year's Best Military and Adventure Science Fiction, so it's of the year. So I'm reading for 2018. And so I have in the past put up on my website, like, you know, if you've had a story that came out or will come out and you think it'd be right, send it to me. I don't think I ever accepted one of those for the book, and so I kind of stopped doing it. I might do it again. I'm not opposed to it, but you know, it's people would send me things that I was already going to be reading anyways, and then the stuff that I didn't find on my own, which you know, in my experience, didn't turn out to be. There's a reason I didn't come across it. You know, not that it was terrible, but it just wasn't going to go in the book. So I have just I seek that stuff out. A few editors, you know, Charlie Finley at FNSF and stuff will, you know, help me out and say like, you know, I read all of them. Well, I don't read all of them, but I look at all the stories anyways. But, you know, hey, I really think this might be one, and so he'll send me them. And Sheila, I can't remember, like she, you know, at Asimov's has done that for me.
What is like
So it's just
what is your
running
like
around.
sort of like guide? Because at that point,
So-
it's not like, you know, when Rebecca's reading
Yeah.
stories, and some are just not there yet, and some are kind of okay, and some are
Right,
better.
yeah.
But like you're reading stories that are
They're
like,
all good.
they're all
yeah,
good.
Right. Yeah. Someone's already liked them. So I'm fortunate in that this is not just year's best science fiction and fantasy or year's best, year's best short stories. So I do have an aesthetic that we're going for with, you know, an adventure or a military theme. And so that helps, and it's science fiction, it's not fantasy, you know. And I'll squint a little bit for, you know, some things. But, and I try to, within that framework, be as broad as I can. But, you know, it's pretty easy to winnow out a lot of it because it's not the type of story or the theme that we're looking for. So that's easy. Then beyond that, it's a matter of, you know, just taste and also trying to, the hardest thing is trying to balance the anthology. Because, you know, I would love to just do an entire, you know, anthology that feels just like David Lynch wrote every short story. That's my own personal taste, but that's not really appropriate for this book, and people probably would get bored with that. So, you know, you know, there's a lot of Space Marine stories. I can't have 18 Space Marine stories that all feel this, that are all action-oriented Space Marine stories, right? So, which Space Marine story or two am I going to put in, and then let me find something else that's different that'll complement that. And you know, if you didn't like this one, here's the next.
You've got your Space Marine slot.
I've got my Space Marine slot. There are probably more than 2 Space Marine slots.
Jack,
If I'm honest.
to flip it on the writer side, when you're sending stories out, I mean, sort of like the easy question is like, do you send to multiple journals at once? Do you send more than one story to a journal at once? Like, how do you choose? Who do you send to? Do you have a tiered system? Like, what's your strategy?
So somebody gave me some great advice pretty early on when I was sending things out, and they told me to find a writer who's doing what you want to do, and they're just a step ahead of you. So don't find a super famous writer or someone who's had a lot of success. Find someone who is
What's Alice Munro doing these days?
right. Yeah, exactly. So find someone who is just a step ahead of you, but you feel like your work is similar to theirs, and they're having just a little more success than you are. So I tend to think about my writing life as a ladder, and I just climbed up on the first rung because I got a little indie publisher to publish my short stories. But before I hit that first rung, I was looking at people who were on that first rung, and I was trying to figure out what they had done. So this was about 5 or 6 years ago, I think before Roxane Gay had really become Roxane Gay, you know, with a capital R and a capital G. And she was writing some really weird, it was right before Untamed State came out, and she was writing some really great, weird short fiction that I was really enjoying, and I would sort of seek her out all the time. Same with Kelly Link. And this was even before Kelly Link had published get in trouble. I think that's what it's called. So I really liked their work, and I felt like my work, if I could find queer equivalents, like journals who would accept stories that were more queer, then I could probably follow in their footsteps. And so I researched a lot, and I found the magazines where they had published, where those sounds really intricate, but where they had also published LGBTQ plus stories, and I felt like I would have a better shot there. So I think that all of the research really, really pays off, because then what it does is I'm not just blitzing every magazine there is and making people like you miserable. And I'm also I'm spending my time more wisely, and so I started having a little bit better luck with sending out to journals. Not great luck, but much better luck. So I was averaging maybe 1 or 2 publications per year for about 5 or 6 years, and for me, that was progress. That was progress, and I was able to put my stuff out there, and people could read it. So I'm just continuing to do that. Now that I've got this little book out, now I'm going to find someone who is one step ahead of me, and I'm going to do the same thing. So, and I feel like the research really, really pays off to find the right place for what you're writing, and then try to develop a relationship there with with those people, because they want what you're writing. It's not like for every story I send it out to also like Tin House, which I know will never take it, and Glimmer Train, which I know will never take it. So I do have my dreams, but I also am realistic about what those places publish.
I also think there's a balancing act between don't self-reject, right? It's not your job to reject your story to Tin House. It's the editor of Tin House's job to reject. But at the same time, don't waste your time. And, and what that looks like to every writer is, some people I know just won't bother with Tin House or FNSF even, right? Because they're like, it's just not going to happen. Why am I wasting my time? Other people say, why not shoot for it? And how that looks to you is going to be different. But I think you want to balance those things of go for it, but don't just keep beating your head against a wall.
And also, by the way,
be smart.
Pay attention to your rejections. I mean, if you get a rejection, even if it's a form rejection that says we were really impressed with your work and would love to see more, that's a good sign. That's not a random nice letter. That means that you got past a whole lot of writers who didn't get that nice letter, and it means that you found somebody who likes your work. And when I say, whatever percentage is solicitations, that doesn't mean, always it's from, our buddy the agent who has the big names who sends us their work. It can be a story, somebody sent a story from Slush that I liked but didn't make it all the way, and I say send me something else to that writer, and that's a solicitation, and that then gets published. And it doesn't come through Slush the second time, it gets read more quickly, but it's also it could be an unpublished author who gets through that way.
I think, too, just very briefly, is something to mention that this is where, literary and genre worlds, just completely diverge. Because just a couple things. Multiple submissions, not multiple, but simultaneous submissions, I assume you take, probably. Yeah. 90%, 99% of genre magazines won't take simultaneous submissions.
They will not?
They will not. Simultaneous submissions will get you no. But their response times are a lot faster. And so it's this weird, this is where where we become the Jets and the Sharks, and the literary world and the genre world have a little knife dance fight. Because the way those two systems work is so completely different. And so I think you want to know that, and know, because if you've written, I'm used to spinning into 12 places at once. If you do that with, FNSF, Asimov's, Clark's World, Lightspeed, whatever, and someone finds out, they'd be like, what is this jerk doing, I don't say it's going to get you blacklisted, but it's not what's done. And vice versa, if you're a genre person, and you sit and you're like, I'm going to submit it to Tin House and wait to hear back. It's like, cool, well, we'll see you in a year and a half. And, so knowing these differences, if you're going to navigate both worlds, especially, is important. Sorry, I just wanted to.
And then, so you get a story that's accepted. You make $1 billion on it because it's a big market, and
Short
then
stories are where the money is.
it's
That
where
in
that's where the
poetry
money
where
is.
the money is.
Strangely enough, one of the biggest buzz about books this year is Tommy Orange's "They're There," which is technically a novel, but is sort of a novel because it's a story collection. But it does happen sometimes.
It does.
Really. But
George Saunders, yeah.
Oscar, when you were working with editors, on Brownsville and with Amigo Land as well, what was your process, both like with the journal editors and then when it came out as a collection? Did you push back on a lot of stuff? Did you have editors saying, "Oh, it's called Brownsville because they're all brown"? I mean, did you what was your relationship with your editors?
You're talking about the stories themselves,
sure.
or just
Yeah.
individually? The first couple of stories were taken without anything. I can't remember really being changed much. There was one that the ending wasn't working, and I had to sort of rework, and it wasn't a huge change, but it was more sort of pulling back a little bit. Yeah, and it's been interesting because I've just changed publishing houses for this next book, and I had a radically different sort of relationship with my first publisher and editor, which is that they basically took 90% of what I wrote and were completely fine with it. The tweaks were fairly minor. There was a story that I had wanted to include in Brownsville, and it had a lot of sex in it, and it was, it sort of stood out. And my editor said it was like, eating a chocolate chip cookie and finding a raisin in it. It just didn't fit. And so I had another story kind of that I was working on, and submitted that, and it worked a lot better. With this current editor, I must have gotten 6-7 pages, single spaced, and I think things happen the way they're meant to happen. I think I know with the first collection, I thought, well, the editor kept it for a month or two, I forget what it was, and she sent it back. She said, "Oh, I'm embarrassed that I don't really have much to change." And I said, "Well, of course not. It's perfect. It's a damn perfect book. I mean, what are you gonna change? And I soothed myself. I just for years on that. The truth is, I don't know that. I mean, I don't know what they were thinking, but I do suspect that at that point, had I had as much editorial feedback as I'm getting now, I don't know how I would have handled it. I think it would have been overwhelming, and I don't know what direction the book might have taken at that point. So I think it found the home it needed for where I was sort of as a writer at that point. And now I can deal with those, with 6-7 pages of comments, and it doesn't faze me in the least bit. I see it as I think where my reader is absolutely engaged in every turn of the story, and so it was a fantastic experience.
One final question, then I want to turn it over to the audience for a couple questions, and this one's for you, Rebecca. Sort of outside of the writer experience with journals, how do journals stay afloat? We joked about getting paid lots of money, but that's not. I mean, journal life is hard, right? Like ASF has actually gone defunct before, and then you brought it back. What does it take to keep a journal going?
I spend a minority of my time editing. I wish that weren't so, but I spend a lot of time writing grants and fundraising and planning an event like the Stars at Night that I invited you all to. And those are all big things. But honestly, they also stay afloat. Like I mentioned, our readers are volunteers. My co-editor and I are much of our time volunteering, and that they stay afloat on as labors of love, basically. unfortunately, that's the way the math shakes out. But yeah, it's certainly being an editor of a small journal, you become a jack of all trades really quickly. Adina, my co-editor, was just joking that if we're ever on a desert island with other people, she's like, I can learn that if it needs surgery, somebody needs surgery, talk to me. How hard could it be? I mean, we've learned everything else. So we do a lot of that sort of thing. But yeah, contests are important. This benefit that we do now every year is important, and it all comes together to help us stay afloat. And I understand totally from the writer's perspective, especially when you're submitting to a ton of places, resenting reader fees, resenting contest fees. That nobody's getting rich off of those. That's not how they work. They keep the journals afloat so that you have some place to be published.
I was going to add with regard, somebody gave me the same advice of, find somebody. But actually, nobody gave me that advice. I just thought of it. I wish somebody had told me that, because I stumbled around for a while, not knowing where to start. And I happened upon I forget what book I was reading, and I had seen this before, but not really paid very much attention to it. On the copyright page of every short story collection, practically, there's a list of where the writer has submitted the work. And so, go downstairs, flip through a few books, find the one that you feel is in your sort of area, that what you're writing, and yeah, you want to find the place that is going to be most receptive to your work, and not every place is, and that's not a reflection on you as a writer. That's just a reflection on what they're into, And if you haven't done that homework, well, you're gonna be wasting some time, and so it's not so much of not wanting to send it places, but just you want to be a little bit more efficient, with your time and energy.
I think, like Rebecca was saying, she spends less time editing than she'd like. I think writers, I was at Dragon Con the other day, and I feel like some of those writers, they are writing so that they'll have an excuse, something that they can market. That's how excited they are about marketing, right? But most writers don't. You'd rather write books and stories, and the thought of researching markets and submitting and agent querying, it's such drudgery, but it's just, you have to do it. So do it smart.
And what Oscar's saying goes for agents too. For those of you looking for agents, find a book by somebody that you like that is similar to what you're working on. And writers tend to thank agents in the acknowledgments, so go find a name there. It's a good place to start.
How much info do you want in a cover letter?
For me, from Slush, cover letters are almost irrelevant. If we've published you before, mention it, because we like to keep it in the family to some extent. But otherwise, it's really not that big a part of the process. But I suspect it could be different in different places and in different parts of the process.
It seems to me every editor I've talked to, so many of them will just literally flip, not even read it until they've read the story, or they don't care. I've never heard anyone be like, really work hard on that cover letter because that's going to sell your story or not. That's not true querying agents.
You're right.
But
Agents,
for
I
short
think,
stories,
show them that you're not just pulling their name out of...
Are there... Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that I personally wouldn't, simply because, if you've done your homework, presumably you're in the range that you should be, and if you start off by saying, well, I'm writing in this tradition or what, it just sets up expectations that you may meet or exceed or whatever, but you want them to sort of read your work with a fresh mind and not be judging you against someone else.
There is an arcane magic to those agent query letters, I think, that it's not the case for short story.
What is the market for story collections? So the shaking head.
Shaking his head.
For my first book, I flew up to New York because the agent thought it was important that I actually meet a couple of editors and they get a feel for me and what have you. And I've not at this point met my agent, we've had a few conversations on the phone, and he says, listen, here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk in. There's going to be some chatting back and forth. It's going to be nice. They're nice people. Don't worry about it. They're nice. At some point, they're going to ask you if you have a novel in you. And you're going to say, and there's this pause on the phone, yes? Correct. That's what you're going to say. And then we're going to wait for the offer to come in. And so, like clockwork, and meet this, and meet the publicist, and meet the, and while sort of walking, and by the way, are you working on anything longer? Do you have a novel on you? Why, yes, I do have a novel on me. But they didn't ask what it was. Interestingly enough, they just wanted to know that this was actually going someplace, and. Yeah, I mean it's legendary. I mean, what the how difficult it is to sell short story collections, and that's sort of what you're up against. I mean, you sort of know that it's a labor of love, and you realize that publishers, people do not. I think that and I may be completely off with this, but I think short story collections tend to be people who are fairly literary and into that, and the novel just has a broader reach, just has a much broader audience. Be walking through an airport and buy one. You could buy one for, your sister at Christmas, whatever. It just has that reach that a collection most times doesn't, and I don't know that that's ever going to change.
I think there is, I agree. And I think especially when you're talking about Big Five, I guess now, New York publishing, that's certainly the case. Although we mentioned the book you mentioned and George Saunders, who've certainly done all right, but that's the exception. But I do think there is, and this I'm coming again from like more in the genre world, but I think the small press is kind of where that thing is happening. And, it might be, kind of a very scrappy, almost zine-like small press, or, it could be something, very, a very handsome limited edition kind of small press that will bring out works by people. But you mentioned Kelly Link, Small Beer Press has done, Howard Waldrop's collections. And so there are places that will take them, but at the same time, yeah, you should probably write a novel. I think you mentioned self-publishing. Ebooks is another place. I know a lot of, again, in the genre world, authors, Alex Ailey Martinez, who's a Texas writer, he's published, a dozen novels, but he self-published his short story collection. And so, he gets a bigger slice of the pie, his fans will buy it, but it didn't make sense for Saga Press to bring out, so that hybrid model, Again, this is in the crass commercial world of science fiction publishing.
So I think we are out of time. Please give our panelists a warm round of applause.
This has been the Writers League of Texas podcast. For more information about the Writers League of Texas and our many programs and services for writers, visit our website at writersleague.org. Email us at wlt@writersleague.org or give us a call at 512-499-8914. Thank you for listening.